It's my pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you everyone for joining us. These short courses are brought to you by the Food Security for Equitable Futures Project. I'm the principal investigator on that. So this is a collaboration between Lancaster University and my co-investigator, Professor Sukumar Velikal, who's at IIT Kanpur. And this is funded by UK Research and Innovation, so big thank you to our funders. So I'd like to begin by talking about why food is essential. I think it's probably fairly obvious to everyone that food is essential for physical health, right? We need food because it provides us with energy, it meets our nutritional needs for complex bodily processes, right? It's obviously essential for our physical health and well-being. But what's sometimes a little bit more overlooked is how important food is for our social well-being and for the creation of our cultural systems. So food shapes and supports our sociocultural systems. It is absolutely central to who we are as human beings. Food is structured into our everyday lives, whether that's planning our days around meals or whether that's feeling the absence of food. It can be an important marker of symbol of social status, right? So it can signal both who we are, the choices that we make can give people information about who we are, but we can also use food to signal who we want to be, right? We can eat aspirational foods that show the identity that we want to construct for ourselves. And it can be a really important expression of social relationships, right? We bond when we share food with people. Sharing meals with people is an important way that human beings bond. Food can be an incredible source of comfort for us, right? You might think when you're ill, there might be foods that you crave because those were the foods that were prepared for you when you were ill as a child, right? You might take great comfort in food. Food can also be a source of conflict, right? Perhaps you're a vegetarian and you've gone somewhere and there's no vegetarian food available for you. What do you do, right? And really importantly, it's a way that we create cultural meaning. So we can both include people and we can exclude people through the rituals and rules that we have around food, right? Maybe there's a way that we bless food. The people who are part of that ritual are included in the group automatically, and the people who don't understand and aren't part of those blessing rituals are automatically sort of excluded from that process, right? So we include and exclude people, and through that, we participate both in our own individual identity making and also identity making for our communities. So it's perhaps unsurprising, given that food is so essential for both our physical well-being and our social well-being, that the right to food was enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specifically in Article 25. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of human rights law, but I do just want to draw some attention to how important it is within a human rights framework. So the UDHR was adopted in 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly, and Article 25 specifically gives the right to food. So Article 25 says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food. And that article also goes on to specify clothing, housing, medical care, and other necessary social services. Now, this was a non-binding document, right? So in other words, there wasn't technically a legal obligation for states to meet these rights. But this was a really important foundational document for subsequent human rights thinking, and some of that has actually come to be codified into law. I'm going to fast forward a little bit now to 1976, which is also a very important turning point. This was the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So this document, again, I won't go through the entire document, we could be here all day, but really importantly, it says that state parties, in order to ensure that everyone can enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as their civil and political rights, state parties to this document have a legally binding obligation to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and freedoms. So you can see the full document. I've given the link here. And you can also see from this map, the countries that are in dark blue are countries that are state parties. In other words, they are the countries that this document is talking about are legally bound to recognize these human rights. Article 11 of this document goes on and says that state parties have to, first of all, recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their family, including adequate food, right? So again, we see repeated here in this document the right to food. And states have an obligation to ensure the realization of this right. They have to do this by taking individually and through international cooperation, right? So it's not enough to just worry about the people within your own borders, right? We have to think globally when we think about human rights. Individually and through international cooperation, states have to take measures, including specific programs, to improve methods of production, conservation, and distribution of food, and to ensure equitable distribution of world food supplies in relation to need, right? So again, thinking outside of our boundaries, both within and across boundaries, there's this obligation for all state parties to this document. And then that leads us to the third document that I want to draw your attention to. So there's a Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights through the UN, and they've issued a series of general comments that clarify on human rights. And the one that's most important for our purposes is General Comment 12, where they give additional information about what's entailed in the right to food and what the obligations of states are. So they say the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food and the means for its procurement. So they issued this clarification in 1999, and they specified that this idea of accessibility of food includes economic and physical components, right? So when we think about economic accessibility of food, what this means is for me to be able to afford an adequate diet that's going to meet my needs and allow me to lead an active and healthy life, the cost of that diet can't endanger my other needs, right? So when we talked about Article 25, we saw the right to food, the right to housing. We might think about things like the right to education, healthcare. My ability to afford food can't jeopardize those other rights as well, right? We have to think holistically about rights. When we think about physical accessibility, this is really drawing attention particularly to the fact that some people experience physical barriers to accessing food, right? So if we think about young children, they're not going to be able to go out and acquire food on their own. We might think about older adults, we might think about physical disabilities. So we have to think about everyone's barriers and make sure that those barriers are removed so everyone can have equitable access to food. This document also talks a bit about what we mean by availability of food, right? So it goes on to explain that availability includes enough food production for the present and for future generations, right? So it's not enough to just look after ourselves and make sure that we have access to food. We also have to give some attention implicitly here to sustainability and to the environment to ensure that future generations will also be able to have access to food. And it also clarifies on what we mean by adequacy, right? So it's gone through in great detail and clarified all of these terms. So adequacy is really referring to the sufficiency not only of quantity of food, which might be the first thing that we think of, right? Making sure everyone is able to eat enough calories to meet their needs, but also the quality of food, not only in terms of things like micronutrients, but also in terms of sociocultural appropriateness, right? So when we think back to the social meaning of food and how important it is for sociocultural systems, that is recognized in the right to food as well. But states who signed on to this document didn't just have to do things overnight, right? They have some time to work towards realizing these rights for everyone. So this does detail a progressive realization as well, right? States need to take action in order to help move their populations towards recognizing the right to food, realizing the right to food, but it doesn't have to happen overnight. And there are sort of three pillars when we start thinking about this idea of progressive realization of the right to food, right? So governments have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill. So the idea of respecting the right to food is you can't do things that actively endanger the right to food, right? So an example of this from the country where I come from is austerity in the UK, right? So we saw with the financial crisis in 2008, we saw all sorts of really important social programs that were particularly important for the well-being of marginalized people were all of a sudden shut down or pared very far back. And we saw a massive rise in food insecurity in the UK associated with that, right? So that's not respecting the right to food, right? States can't take actions that are actually eroding the right to food for their population, right? States also need to take actions to protect the right to food. So the idea here is that states need to do things to, for example, prevent third parties from violating the right to food. This might involve, for example, regulating corporate pollution, because if we think about, again, our current right to food, but also future generations, protecting the environment to ensure that we'll be able to produce food is really essential. So we need to take actions to stop anyone who might be threatening the environment and threatening our ability to produce food. And then third is fulfill, right? So the idea here is it's not enough to just do no harm. States actually need to take action to actively strengthen people's access to food, right? So the idea here would be, for example, instead of doing what the UK did and taking away these social protection measures, you might introduce social protection measures that mean that people are actually able to afford and access food. So this brings us to a couple of key questions that are sort of underlying the next 2 days, right? If we know that food is essential for our physical and our social well-being, for our cultural systems, if we know that access to food is a human right, what happens when people don't have access to food? Why do some people experience difficulties accessing food? Who's most at risk, right? We know that some people experience greater difficulties accessing than others, so who's most at risk? And then how can we as researchers start to understand these difficulties? So these are the sorts of questions that we're going to be grappling with over the next 2 days. And this brings us to actually defining food security, right? So what is food security? The UN Food and Agriculture Organization defines food security as a situation in which all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which meets their dietary needs and preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle, right? So again, we see here it's not just about meeting caloric needs, but it also is about having socially appropriate food. So there are many different sort of frameworks showing that food insecurity is a complex, multidimensional concept. There are some that add additional dimensions. I'm just going to grapple with a few of the dimensions of food insecurity here. So when we think about food insecurity, it's not just, yes, I'm food secure or I'm food insecure. And it's not just about this particular moment in time, right? So when we think about food insecurity being multidimensional, we might think, for example, about the availability of food, right? Is there even food for me to be able to get access to, right? So we saw, for example, during COVID, all of a sudden there were a bunch of grocery shops that had empty shelves. There were big problems with our supply chains. Availability was impacted by COVID, right? Is there food around me that I could access theoretically? But even if there is food around, that doesn't mean that I can access it, right? So can I, for example, afford food? Have the prices of the food that's available to me risen so much that I'm not able to purchase food anymore? Even if there's food available, even if I have access to that food, my utilization of that food might matter. So for example, do I have consistent access to good refrigeration, right? If I'm not able to eat my food before it goes bad, that's also going to impact my food security, right? And then there's the stability of these things over time, right? So maybe I have availability of food today, but I don't have availability of food tomorrow. Maybe I'm a wage laborer, so sometimes I have enough money to be able to afford food, and sometimes I don't, right? My income is precarious. The other thing that I want to draw attention to is how we might start to think about food insecurity as a dynamic gradient. And what I mean by that is it's not just a binary category, I'm food secure or I'm food insecure, and it's not something that just occurs in one moment of time, right? We might experience changes in our food security status over time. So we can think about the severity of food insecurity, and that helps us to understand that idea of food security as a gradient. So this is a figure from Food and Agriculture Organization showing food security on the left and severe food insecurity on the right, with moderate food insecurity in the middle. So if I'm food secure, I'm not worried. I have access. I'm not worried about whether I'm going to lose that access to food. If I'm experiencing mild food insecurity, I might be starting to worry about my access to food. When we move into more moderate food insecurity, I might have to start taking actions like skipping meals or swapping out food items. Maybe there's a food item that's important to me, but it's just become too expensive, so I swap it out for something else. And then when we move towards more severe food insecurity, this might involve me going a full day or even longer without any food at all. So that speaks to the gradient aspect. The dynamic aspect, we might think about how food insecurity varies in terms of its duration. So it might be really sporadic, right? Maybe I've experienced a short spell of food insecurity and that was it. It might be seasonal. It might be every year we get through our sort of stock from the harvest and we're waiting before we can harvest the next crop, and we're experiencing food insecurity every year at the same time of year. Or it might be chronic. It might just be that I live with food insecurity regularly as a part of my everyday life. And it's really important that we start to understand these things because the consequences of food insecurity vary according to both the severity of food insecurity and its duration. I do also just want to take a moment to distinguish food insecurity from some other concepts that are very closely related to, but not precisely the same thing as food insecurity. So I want to draw attention to two concepts in particular. One is hunger and the other is undernutrition. So these are both physical consequences of insufficient caloric intake or we might also say insufficient caloric absorption. So people who are experiencing things like sanitation problems and diarrheal disease might actually technically be consuming enough calories, but not able to absorb that food, right? So both of these can be and often are consequences of food insecurity, but there's not a perfect overlap as that sanitation example highlights, right? I also want to highlight that we might start to see the implications of food insecurity long before it starts to manifest in terms of things like undernutritional markers, right? So for example, the stigma that I might experience by experiencing food insecurity will start to have a meaningful impact on my life very quickly and long before you start to be able to measure that in terms of my physical characteristics. Okay. So you will hear much more about the impacts of food insecurity over the next 2 days. I'm just going to give a really sweeping sort of overview of some of the reasons why we should care about food insecurity and why it matters. So food insecurity can have lasting impacts across the life course on, as we've mentioned, physical health, right? So undernutrition and overweight and obesity associated with food insecurity. We also see micronutrient deficiencies associated with food insecurity. It can impact on our immunity, right? We might get sick more if we're not getting appropriate nutrition. And it can also matter for things like maternal health, fetal development, pregnancy outcomes, right? Food is essential for us for all of these reasons, right? For our growth, for our development, for our immunity. It can also impact on our psychosocial well-being, as I've alluded to already, right? We can experience shame, irritability, right? Stigma, social exclusion, right? If we can't share food with people, we might feel excluded from those social dynamics. And it's really important for things like child development. So a lot of the literature on the impacts of food insecurity from child development comes particularly from global minority countries in the global north. But we're seeing growing evidence coming from the global south as well. So we know that it has impacts on impairing cognition for children, their cognitive development, their ability to concentrate in class, right? So this is a figure on the right here taken from a paper that my collaborators and I, including Professor Velikal, who you'll hear from next, wrote a couple of years ago, looking precisely at this issue of how food insecurity impacts on children's educational outcomes. And this was a study looking specifically at India. So we took some data where children and their families were interviewed when the children were age 5, when the children were age 8, and when the children were age 12, and looked at what it meant for children to be in a food insecure household at each of those time periods. Were they only food insecure at age 5? Were they food insecure for that entire period, or something in between? And you can see here, anything above the line is showing that children's scores are higher. Anything below the line is showing that their scores are lower. So the one bar that's above the line for their vocabulary scores, their reading scores, their math scores, and their English scores are children who were in food secure households the entire time. Children who experienced food insecurity at any of the periods they were observed had lower test scores across these different domains, right? Vocabulary, reading, maths, and English. And what we also see, that darkest bar, the one that's lowest down, in other words, the children who had the lowest test scores across these domains, are the children who were chronically food insecure. In other words, the children who were food insecure at age 5, at age 8, and age 12, right? So we see that food insecurity matters, and the more of it you experience, the worse it is for children's learning outcomes. And these implications of food insecurity are important not only for the sake of that right to food, but also because actually that's related to those interconnected rights. So we can't treat human rights as a piecemeal project. We have to care about the right to food, but also the right to housing and also the right to medical care and all of these things that are enshrined in human rights because they affect one another. So that same committee that I mentioned, that Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in that General Comment 12 document, they also went on to say the right to adequate food is indivisibly linked to the inherent dignity of the human person and is indispensable for the fulfillment of human rights. I cannot meet my other human rights if my right to food is threatened. And I'm just going to give you a few very brief examples of that. So we know, obviously, that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, that I talked about at the beginning, enshrine the right to food, the right to housing, the right to medical care. It's very obvious that going without food is a direct threat to the right to food, but also remember things that fall into the category of moderate food insecurity, like swapping out food items, can also be a threat to the right to food because the right to food includes sociocultural appropriateness of food. It can also threaten my right to housing. So there's a phenomenon called heat or eat. We might also think about cooling homes, but the idea is that we have energy costs for heating and cooling our homes and keeping them safe and habitable for us. And when we're worried about being able to afford food, we might have to make really difficult decisions of, do I spend money on heating my home? Do I spend money on cooling my home? Or do I spend money on food? And in fact, there's been a paper by Snell, Lambie, and Thompson that goes on to argue that actually this label of heat or eat is a bit incorrect, because in fact many people experience both. They can't heat their home and they can't afford food, or they can't cool their home and they can't afford food. So very often actually it's heat nor eat, right? So food insecurity can be a real threat, not just to the right to food, but also to the right to housing. Likewise, we see a similar phenomenon with medical care, right? So this is again called treat or eat, and I would go so far as to argue it might also be treat nor eat in some cases, where people have to decide, do I pay for this important medical procedure? Do I pay for my medical care? Or do I spend money on food, which we know is also important for our health, important for our immunity, right? Important for our recovery if we've had a surgery. So people are placed in really difficult positions where they have to sort of trade off one human right and another. And so it is no surprise at all that food security takes a really central place in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So the Sustainable Development Agenda was introduced in 2015, and the second Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 2, is to end hunger and achieve food security. Unfortunately, achievement of this goal is looking increasingly unlikely. There was very good progress on this goal in a variety of places, sort of globally, and in a lot of places that were experiencing severe hunger. But unfortunately, that progress has been slowed, or in some places it's even been reversed for a variety of reasons, and I'm just going to touch on a few of those reasons quickly here. One is economic downturns, right? So we have seen since 2008 wave after wave of economic downturn. This matters at both the state and individual level in terms of generating income and resources. And it also matters because alongside this, we've seen rising food prices. So just at the time that people are experiencing more and more difficulties getting sufficient income, we're also seeing rising food prices. So food is taking up a larger and larger share of many people's household budgets. We've also seen the climate crisis, and the climate crisis has had sweeping impacts on our food systems, and unfortunately will continue to have stronger and stronger impacts on our food systems as it continues to unfold. But just as a couple of examples, the climate crisis is associated with things like diminished crop yields, it impacts on rainfall and river levels, which are important for irrigation, important for fisheries, right? And of course, COVID-19. We can't talk about food security without talking about COVID-19 at this point. So we know that COVID impacted on global and local food chains, created a host of problems globally around the world. And also it was associated with a lot of health shocks and loss of incomes at the individual level. So many people were suddenly out of work, right? Or suddenly they had a very ill family member or lost a family member during COVID, and that had huge ramifications for their well-being and their ability to access food. Another issue that's really impacting on progress or slowing of progress, reversal of progress, is food waste. So there are many different places where we waste food. One of those is during the production process, right? So during the production process, many times things like damaged food gets discarded, or sometimes producers overproduce food, they can't sell that food, and so it just gets discarded, right? Food can also be wasted at the point of sale. Again, a lot of food gets discarded if it's damaged at the point of sale. There might be food that sits on shelves too long, becomes expired or rotten, and it gets thrown out. But I would also include in this category food that's not eaten at restaurants, right? Whether those are too large portions or food that was just overproduced in the kitchen and never made it onto plates. And then, of course, at home, we also waste food, right? We discard food. So there might be excess food that we prepared at home. Maybe we're not eating leftovers. We're letting things go into the bin. But also, we might have expired or rotten products, whether that's because we're purchasing too much or because perhaps our refrigeration is unreliable. We see a lot of expired and rotten products as well. And food waste is unfortunately a growing problem. So in 2022, the UN Environment Program, UNEP, estimated that 132 kilos of food was wasted per capita per year in 2022. 79 kilos of this, so about 60% of that figure, was wasted in households, right? So actually a lot of that food waste that I talked about is happening within households, more than half of it, right? And they estimate that this is 1 billion meals per day that get wasted. And we can see that this is a growing problem if we compare this, for example, to the figures from 2019. So in 2019, the UNEP said that about 120 kilos per person per capita. So compare that to the 132 as of 2022. That's a very short period for such a large increase in our food waste. This also creates a growing demand for food, right? There's this sort of irony that we're producing and producing and producing, and then when we throw it out, we have to go and produce and produce and produce, right? So this growing demand for food is a massive driver of land dispossession, right? The more we have large-scale industrial farming, that has to happen somewhere, right? And very often the most marginalized people lose their land as a part of that process. It also has climate crisis ramifications. When we're wasting all of this food, there's all of the agricultural resource that went into that food that gets wasted, right? So things like fertilizers and water that are essential. But there's also gases released by the food itself, right? So it's estimated that about 10% of our greenhouse gases are down to food waste, right? And this, as I say, disproportionately impacts marginalized people globally, right? Both directly, these sort of issues of land dispossession and climate crisis ramifications, and also its links to food insecurity. So you might be wondering at this point, well, how big a problem is food insecurity? Where are we in terms of the prevalence of food insecurity? This is just showing a sort of recent snippet precisely because we have seen such a sort of stark reversal in terms of progress on food security, particularly associated with the COVID-19 period. So these data are, again, from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. I have the link here at the top. They have a wealth of data that you can go and lose hours or days to at some point. I encourage you to have a look. But you can see here the figures from 2019 through 2023. And this is showing the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity. So remember, this is including things like swapping out food items, maybe reducing the size of your meals, but also including things like going a full day without food, right? So we can see about 25%, this is the global figure, world figure, so about 25% of people were experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity in 2019. And then we see quite a large increase in 2020. COVID hits, we see a rise to nearly 30%, right, 28.8%, a little bit more of a rise in 2021, and we've pretty much tapered off there, right? We've not seen a huge recovery back down to this figure of 25% prior to the pandemic. If we look at the figures for the Southern Asia region, including India, and I'm going to show you the figures excluding India and then including India, because we don't have the figures for food insecurity prevalence for India itself. So I'm going to show you regional figures, right? So this is Southern Asia excluding India, and you can see here that the figures are higher for this region, right? So it's the top line, but we also see the gap between the world figure and the regional figure grow during COVID-19, and we don't see a recovery of that. Then if we add India into the figure, so India is the lightest color here, it's the top line, we see that India's prevalence of food insecurity was even higher than the world figure and the regional figure, but we do actually see some leveling off once we've included India in the statistics so that it comes in line, the Southern Asia excluding India and the Southern Asia including India. But we can see here that 41.7% as of 2023, 41.7% regionally were experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity. This is a huge figure, right? I also want to share with you the figures on undernourishment. Now, undernourishment is not precisely the same thing as measuring food insecurity in the previous slides that I showed you. So prevalence of undernourishment is the percent of the population eating less than the minimum calorie requirements, right? And this is adjusted for things like children need fewer calories than adults do, for example. Okay? So the percent of people who are eating fewer than their minimum required calories. And this is sort of the best national level approximation we have when we don't have those figures for moderate and severe food insecurity directly. But I do want to highlight that these estimates tend to be lower than what we would get from a food insecurity scale, right? So to give you an example, in the 2021 to 2023 period for Southern Asia, the prevalence of undernourishment was 14.2%. If we compare that to the scale of food insecurity, and you'll hear much more about the scale to measure food insecurity soon. If we compare that to the figures for severe food insecurity, so that's going a whole day without food, right? We see 19.4%. If we look at moderate and severe food insecurity, 41.3% in that same period, right? But I'm going to show you the prevalence of undernourishment, and just bear in mind that that tends to be lower than food insecurity. So if we look at the prevalence of undernourishment for India, we see here that progress that I was talking about, right? We see a lowering of the prevalence of undernourishment, and then we see COVID hit and a rise in undernourishment, right? So the prevalence of undernourishment in India in 2021 to 2023 was 13.7%. So that's 13.7% of the population getting less than the minimum calories that they would need. In terms of absolute numbers, that's 194.6 million people, and that's about 68% of the people in the region who are experiencing prevalence of food insecurity, or prevalence of undernourishment. So in the Southern Asian region, 284.8 million people were experiencing undernourishment. In India, 194.6 million. But I want to highlight two really important caveats to that. First of all, this is actually very proportionally similar, right? So if we think about the prevalence of undernourishment in India is remarkably similar to the region, but India has a larger population. So of course, India is going to be a larger absolute number of people, right? I also want to highlight that this is reflecting actually remarkable progress overall. I know I'm drawing attention to the reversal of progress, to the slowing of progress, because of the really stark impact of COVID-19. But if we compare these figures from 2021 to 2023 to figures from 2004 to 2006, in 2004 to 2006, in India alone, there were 246.5 million people who were experiencing undernourishment, right? We compare that to 2021 to 2023, that's 50 million people fewer, right? And at the same time, we've seen population growth. So this is really remarkable progress. And this is remarkable progress despite COVID-era setbacks, right? So this is even reflecting this increase in undernourishment over the COVID period. Okay. So we've established food insecurity is a massive problem globally. It's a massive problem in the region. It's a massive problem at the country level. What can states do? States have this obligation to fulfill the right to food, right? What should they be doing about food insecurity? There are many things that they can do. One of them is the worst option, which is absolutely nothing, or even worse, enacting policies which worsen food security, and again, worsen food insecurity. And again, I'm going to draw attention to austerity, which is this idea that you're taking away social protection programs that are there to provide a safety net for marginalized people, right? We saw this, I mentioned the UK, but we saw this actually across Europe, this sort of taking away of these social protection, these safety nets. And we saw alongside this trend of taking away social safety nets, we saw a massive rise in food insecurity, right? So governments can do nothing or can even fail to respect the right to food, right? They can take actions that threaten the right to food. We're going to call that the very worst option. Another thing that states can do, and many states do in fact do, is they say, okay, well, we're going to call this a problem for charity. We're going to rhetorically and or financially support charity as a response to food insecurity, right? It's not something we think the government should be addressing. It's something that we think is best done by local charities. This isn't to say that charities are bad or that people who are involved in charities are bad, right? But the idea is actually that charities cannot adequately address this on their own, and it is a state responsibility to fulfill the right to food, right? So it's sort of passing along the responsibility to someone else. And I want to draw attention, I won't go through all of the details of this book, but there's a fantastic book from 1999. It's still as relevant as ever, even though it's 25 years old now, by Janet Poppendieck. And she talks about the 7 ins of charitable responses. So I'm not going to go through all 7, but I'll just give you a few for a flavor of what she's talking about. So one of the issues with charitable responses that she's talking about is insufficiency, right? So the idea here is that charities really struggle to provide enough food. This is a really extremely difficult thing for a charity to be able to do, in part because they can't centrally monitor food insecurity, right? So who is in need is going to vary. And very often, the people who are most in need of these services because charity can be a stigmatizing thing, very often the people who are in need don't access those services, right? Another in that she talks about is instability, right? So she says, in fact, people donate money, they volunteer, they give their time when they feel able to do so. Usually what that means is when times are good, they have money, they have time, right? So as soon as people urgently need the labor and urgently need the donations, that's when people are suddenly going, oh, times are difficult, I'm going to hang on to things for myself. My resources are precious, right? So very much at the time that charity is most needed is the time that it is the hardest to get the resources for. A third in that I'll draw your attention to is inaccessibility, right? So charities very often rely on free labor donated by people, which means that they have to accept people's labor when they can get it. Very often that is not aligning with when people who would be using the charities are able to access those charities, right? So charities operate around donor availability and not around the needs of the people that they're serving, right? So the groups with the greatest need level may be least well served. And likewise, very often, there are a lot of people who are willing to donate their resources and donate their time in very well-off communities, right? So those charities are very often located in the wrong places as well. So we'll call this the second worst option. The best option would be to actually enact policies that realize the right to food. And there are just a dizzying array of ways that states can do this. So obviously, every place is different, right? We have different populations with different needs, we have different resources, different particular contexts. And so each state has to figure out what are the things that work for our population, what do we need, and how can we provide what's needed. So there's a whole suite of possibilities. And there's actually this fantastic document from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization that is voluntary guidelines for realizing the right to food. So I've given you just a screenshot here of what that document looks like and just the first page of the table of contents to give you an idea of just how many options are available to states, right? And if you want to see the full document, I have the link here available as well. But just to give you a flavor of a couple of the possibilities, first of all, monitoring food insecurity, right? It is really difficult to solve a problem that you don't know is there. And in fact, sometimes we have seen states be a bit reluctant to monitor food insecurity because then it's a problem that people know and understand the scale of and feel like they need to address, right? And expect states to address. So monitoring food security, monitoring food insecurity is a really important part of being able to address it. States might also do something like thinking about livelihoods and how they might support people's livelihoods. So they might introduce some policies around employment that will help to get people into good, fulfilling work, right? Good, well-paid work that will allow them to meet their livelihood needs. We might also think, again, about that sort of implication of the need to address sustainability to produce for current generations and future generations, and we might see states take action towards ensuring more sustainable production of food, right? So this might be things like thinking about equitable and sustainable water and land use, right? States might take actions to provide safety nets, right? Perhaps in some cases reinstate safety nets, right? So this might involve things like, for example, thinking about those physical barriers to accessing food and introducing disability support as one of your suite of social protection programs, right? So the possibilities are sort of endless, and I really encourage you to have a look at this document in detail, but hopefully that at least gives you a flavor of the many things that states can be doing to help to realize the right to food. Okay. That's it from me this morning.